Anyway, my name is Peg Bartel, and welcome to the Center for Spiritual Deepening. We are very happy to have LJ Milone with us again. He's been doing a series for us on mystics for now 5 years, 6 years, someplace in the history of the Center for Spiritual Deepening. Tonight we're going to be talking, we're going to have 3 sessions on Theresa of Avila. The first 2 sessions will be on Zoom, the only, and the third session we're thinking about doing maybe a hybrid event with Zoom and a potluck. So we'll see how that goes. But as many of you know, LJ is the director of faith formation at St. Matthew's Cathedral. He is also a deep scholar of the Christian mystics, and he always gives us a really great presentation. So when we're on Zoom, if you want to put your questions in the chat, you can do that. We will have a time for a break. We will have breakout rooms at the end, and we will also take questions at the end. LJ will be sharing his screen for the presentation, and he's the primary guy. So take it away, LJ.
Thanks, Peg. I almost called you Pam. I'm sorry.
Hey,
the business
okay.
manager at work is named Pam, and I call her all the time. So, and not a unhelpful faux pas there, because Terry, or Theresa of Avila, knew a lot of people and worked in an everyday environment. She had her own business manager that she would talk to. She had her own friends. She had her hands deep in the dirt and in the business of every day. I was remarking to everybody earlier, this where I am in my basement with a ladder here and the slop sink and the dryer and the washer. Theresa would be at home. She's a mystic of every day. And maybe throughout the series, I'm going to try and refer to her as much as I can as Terry, because Theresa of Avila, Saint Theresa of Avila, the doctor of the church, in the Catholic Church at least, sounds very formal. She was, and I'm going to tell you, there were a lot of extraordinary things that happened to her, but she was deep down a very ordinary person, a very ordinary mystic. So I hope we can come away with that sense through the series. But let me share my screen here so we can get started. Okay. So I titled our series, Let Nothing Disturb You, because I'd like to begin with this prayer. It's known as Theresa's bookmark. And it's a poem that we think she wrote. We're actually not entirely sure, but rather sure that it's a poem she wrote. And it was found as a bookmark in one of her books. Terry loved to read. So I invite you to pray with me. Take a moment to collect yourself. Close your eyes, take a big, deep breath. And listen. Let nothing disturb you. Let nothing frighten you. All things are passing. God only is changeless. Patience gains all things. Who has God wants nothing. God alone suffices. Amen. So that is Terry's bookmark, and that really does encapsulate her spirituality, her mysticism. We'll get into it as in our presentation this evening, but for her, it's a big experiential insight that all things are passing. And when we have God, there's no reason to fear or even to be disturbed. All right, there's Terry herself, a wonderful image. Terry was a Spaniard, and she lived in Spain in the 16th century. So she lived in the 1500s. So just a little background. Starting in 1492, Spain entered a golden age. In fact, 1492 was called the Year of Miracles because it was the end of the Reconquista from Muslim Granada, the union of Aragon and Castile, which were the big Christian kingdoms, and there was the discovery of America by Columbus, and Mexico was conquered shortly thereafter in 1521. So a lot of gold, a lot of wealth flowed into Spain, and at this point, Spain is the world superpower, more or less. You might notice 1521, you good Protestants. That's not too far off from Luther nailing the theses to the doors of the Wittenberg Cathedral. So as that grew, the Protestant Reformation, Spain became, how do I put this delicately, crazy. Spain got very fanatical and started to define itself as the Catholic country. So a little of that infects Theresa, but she is one of the things that is so wonderful about her is that she's so level-headed in a very fanatical time. She's a very level-headed nun. So as wealth grows in Spain, there was also a divide that grew, and it grew along religious and ethnic lines. There were these pure bloods versus these mixed bloods. Now, a little explanation there. Spain, for a long time, basically since the Muslims conquered Spain in the, I think it was 800s or 900s, Spain was a region of Europe that had all three religions living more or less in harmony, but really under a kind of enforced peace from the Caliphate. So it was Muslims, Christians, and Jews, more or less. It wasn't like paradise, but it was still the Middle Ages, more or less living in peace. But then the Christian kingdoms of Spain started to gain power, and they conquered little territory by little territory to take it back from the Muslim rulers, which was completed in 1492. But not all of the people who were Jewish and Muslim left Spain. As a result, we had, you might have heard of it, the Spanish Inquisition, where people were forced to convert or die. So many chose to convert. Some chose to convert and just go along with the faith of Christianity. Others chose to keep it superficially and then in secret practice Judaism or Islam. And this affects Theresa because many families in Spain were mixed families. So maybe a person who was formerly Jewish and now Catholic was married to a Catholic. That was Theresa's situation. Her grandfather was a full-blooded Jewish man, and he married a Catholic woman, and then everybody in their family, because of that one grandfather, was called mixed blood. Rather than the pure bloods, the purely Christian families who kind of were the ones conquering or reconquering from the Muslim kingdoms. So there was this kind of racial, slightly racial, because they all more or less looked the same, but slightly racial, slightly ethnic, religious kind of divide. And it was very real. People like Theresa and her friend John of the Cross, who we think was, we don't really know which one, but he was either from Muslim or Jewish stock. They didn't get any positions of power. They were second class. They weren't necessarily, enslaved or oppressed overtly, but they were clearly second class citizens. And that's reflected in Terry's Carmelite community that she joins. The people who are rich and are pure bloods have these huge rooms, and the ones who are not don't. They sleep in dormitories and they have very little possessions. So that culture kind of follows her throughout her life. Well, speaking of her life, let me give you a little timeline of Terry. So she's born in 1515 in Avila, and she died in Alba de Tormes in 1582 at the ripe age of 67. which was rather old for the time. In 1529, her mother died. She was only 14. Then in 1535, she becomes a Carmelite nun. She makes her final profession in 1537. So then what follows is a period of sickness. In 1539, she gets sick. She goes to Besadas for a cure. A paralysis followed. She was paralyzed, full body paralysis for about 2 years. She had to relearn how to walk and how to use her limbs. In 1543, her father dies, and she's 28 at this time. In 1554, she undergoes a profound conversion. Now, hold on to that date, because you might have noticed in 1535, she became a nun. Wouldn't she have had a conversion ahead of time? This is another thing that I love about Terry. She is real. She did have a conversion earlier in life, maybe when she was a teenager, desired to be a nun, and then she kind of lost it. She kind of got mediocre. She kind of got the fervor of that religious feeling cooled off. And she definitively becomes a mystic in 1554. We're going to go through that tonight. 1554, she also starts to have her mystical life. In 1560, she begins work as a writer. Her first writing to reach us is Spiritual Testimony 1. In 62, she began her task as founder, the foundation of her first Carmel, which was in Avila. We'll cover that a little bit tonight. So a Carmel, this is the language of this community. A Carmel is a community of Carmelite nuns or friars. That's a Carmel. This is really just a community in a specific house. In 1567, she starts to found other Carmels throughout Spain, and she journeys to Medina del Campo. In 1575, her brother Lorenzo and his family returned to Spain from the Indies. In 1581, she begins her last journey from Avila to Burgos to Alba de Tormes, and she dies on October 15th, 1582. So that's her feast day if you're interested, October 15th. Now, let's go a little further, little drill down on these notable periods in her life. So she spent 20 years at home, 1515 to 35. And even though her dad, it's hard to say, he might have practiced Judaism as a boy, but he was clearly a devout Catholic when he has Terry. And then, so he and Terry's mom, they raised them, all her and her siblings, as devout Catholics. She spends 27 years in the Carmelite Monastery of the Incarnation, so 1535 to 1562. And they started with there was about 100 nuns there. And by the time 1562, she leaves. She was the prioress, the head of the community for a few years in the late 1550s and the early 1560s. The monastery swelled, excuse me, to 200 nuns. She has 28 years of profound mystical experience, 54 to 82, and 22 years as a writer, 1560 to 1582. So she writes 4 major books: The Life, The Way of Perfection, Foundations, and The Interior Castle, which is probably the one you know her for. If not, you may have read her life. That is a very popular book as well, but probably more The Interior Castle is the most popular. Tonight, we're going to look at The Life, because that covers her initial life. But those are her 4 major books. We're going to cover all 4 in the series. Next week, we're going to cover The Way of Perfection and Foundations. Those are the lesser read books, but also very good. And then in our last class, we'll cover The Interior Castle. But Theresa is known for one teaching. She is a doctor of prayer, a teacher of prayer. She has many things to say, but they all revolve around the practice of prayer. So Terry's going to tell us how to pray. So tonight we're going to start with her own prayer life, which she describes as a model for how God's mercy lifts up a sinner as bad as herself. Those are her words, which she repeats often throughout her life. So let's turn to the book of her life. First thing to note, and this will give you a little background. When Terry was sick, she was back at her father's house, and she writes this. On the way to my sister's village, we stopped in to see my Uncle Pedro. He gave me a copy of the Third Spiritual Alphabet by Francisco de Osuna. This book is all about the prayer of recollection. In the past year, I had realized what harm my appetite for romance novels had done to my soul. And I had begun to develop a tremendous appreciation for spiritual books. Since I did not know a thing about the practice of contemplative prayer or how to go about recollecting my senses and my thoughts, I was thrilled to find a book that told me exactly what to do. I set out on the path of contemplation with all my might. So you can see there, first of all, she loves to read. And she identifies an early attachment, romance novels, which I just think is, again, makes her very human. And then she finds this book by a Franciscan friar named Francisco de Osuna. So it would behoove us to get a little background on him to understand Terry more. So Francisco de Osuna was born in that miracle year, 1492. So he's about 20 years or so older than Terry. And he becomes a Franciscan in 1513. He lived at the desert in La Salceda. The Franciscan friars had houses of contemplation dotting the landscape of medieval Spain, Renaissance Spain. The deserts were places where they practiced recollection, silent prayer, contemplative prayer for many hours a day. And they taught not only other friars how to do this practice, they also taught lay people. So this is an interesting period of the church. Lay people were practicing contemplative prayer. That was not something they normally did. And this was kind of happening all over Spain. And so he writes kind of the compendium of the practice of recollection, their term at that time for like silent meditation. And that work is called the Third Spiritual Alphabet. It was also the most popular work. So it's no wonder that she ran across a copy of it. You can still read that if you like. It is very long. And I've read it. I like Francisco a lot, and he has a lot of wonderful teachings. He needed an editor to slim that guy down a little. So his work was read, enjoyed, praised, and deeply affected St. Theresa of Avila, because she started to do recollection. And recollection, there's one key phrase to know. No pensar nada. Think nothing. Non-thinking nothingness. There's a few ways to translate this phrase, but it boils down to you pray by not thinking, resting in God's presence in faith. And Osuna tries to describe this a little bit. So I invite you to just close your eyes and listen to this. This is excellent spiritual advice, I think. The more thoughts you entertain, the hungrier and more greedy you will be for different experience, according to the wise man. The soul running loose will be hungry. The soul is ruined and dissolute when it allows the mind and thoughts to flit about wantonly, running off wherever they wish. When they finally do wander home, worn out, dying of hunger, they come dragging behind an even heavier load of desire and greed. And one of the points here is that distractions divide the soul and dry up desire. But it's rooted in our thoughts. It's rooted in the very first phrase in this paragraph. The more thoughts you entertain, the greedier you will get. In Treatise 3 in the Third Spiritual Alphabet, Osuna says, this is how the soul is to be with God. Blind and deaf and dumb, or a better word would be mute. Blind and deaf and mute, and always meek. gentle. He writes, the exterior and interior senses and reason itself cannot continue to function in recollection, but must abandon their acts and works, and the operations of these powers will be completely stilled. Meaning, stop thinking. Blind in the spirit, being silent within, engaging in no reflection whatsoever, we must be deaf and forbid thought to enter. So don't listen to your thoughts. Don't look at your thoughts. We advisedly combined in our letter the two words mute and deaf, so that through the one we might defend ourselves against thoughts we ourselves cause and purposefully excite, while the other would aid us in repelling thoughts that originate from our countless worldly affairs and vanities. Don't listen to your thoughts. Don't talk to your thoughts. Don't look at your thoughts. He says, quiet our hearts, observe perpetual silence, if we wish to ascend to high contemplation, or be blind, deaf, and mute to be absorbed in God. I miss maybe a little spooky, this image, but I realized it's actually rather appropriate because in 16th century Spain, they loved skulls. It is macabre, but it is a fact. They loved skulls because they were very aware and they wanted to remain aware of death. So seeing a skeleton actually helped them go deeper. And so Terry would see a skull and she would leap for joy, and she might go into a state of prayer where she was blind, deaf, and mute to her thoughts so she could be absorbed in God. So this is what Terry starts to practice, okay? The life, or vida in Spanish, it's a lot like St. Augustine's Confessions. It's not an autobiography. It's rather a long prayer and a testimony to God's mercy, to what God did for Theresa. At the beginning of her major conversion, she learns this practice of recollection. So she's sick. She's a nun already, but she got sick, and she goes a little deeper through prayer, through the practice of recollection or silent meditation. So she starts to practice no pensar nada, which involves silencing mental activity to be fixed in God alone. But here's another way she describes her prayer. When I was in prayer, I would try to keep Jesus Christ, our Lord and our good, present within me. I would think about a scene in his life and then try to picture it with my mind's eye. But what I liked best was to read good books. She loves books. Just loves books. Terry had a practice of doing 2 hours of prayer a day, but she didn't do 2 hours of silent meditation a day. She had kind of several forms of prayer going on at once. She had the silence of no pensar nada. She has, I would try and keep Jesus Christ present. I think about a scene in his life. And she has reading. And really thinking about the scene in his life, you could kind of broaden that to scripture. And then reading a spiritual book, those helped her, as well as time spent in nature. Those helped her quiet her mind so she could have some good time to simply enjoy God in the silence of no pensar nada. So she writes, these are all quotes from the life. All they need to do is to invite you, she's addressing God, invite you to be with them for at least 2 hours a day. It doesn't even matter if they are incapable of being with you, but are caught up in 1,000 revolving thoughts and distractions, as I used to be. Simply making the effort to be in your company may be all they can do at the beginning, sometimes even later on. So right away, Terry's identifying with us. She is one of us. She gets distracted. She at least used to get distracted. She's writing this after she had already gone through a turbulent time in her life. But she's being, I think, very, not just gracious, but very real. When you start to pray on a regular basis, it's going to be a little hard. You're going to have a lot of distracting thoughts. but just do it. That's her kind of teaching here. And then she writes, I had trouble keeping my attention on God. I was more interested, I love this. I was more interested in when the hour I had allotted myself for prayer would be over than I was in abiding in quietude with my beloved. So imagine this, okay? She doesn't have iPhone, she doesn't have TV. You know, before we were logging on tonight, I was watching The Sopranos. She doesn't have The Sopranos. You know, she's got just God, right? I mean, she's got prayer services and mass that she goes to, but she's a nun. This is her job, you could say. And she is more interested in kind of proverbially looking at her watch, right? Than in actually abiding in quietude with her beloved. She writes, sometimes I felt such overwhelming sadness when I entered the chapel that I could hardly bear it. But once I made the effort, the beloved helped me. And that's a good summary of her book right there. She lost it, so she starts to practice recollection, but over about 20 years, she kind of loses it. She doesn't really want to do it. She gets distracted by other things outside of prayer. And so she started experiencing trouble in her prayer life, and she didn't want to do it, but when she did do it, she found it was actually quite delightful and even easier. I did not always feel like praying. Who does sometimes, right? But either because of the power of my struggle or the grace of God, I persevere and have derived indescribable benefits from it. Seeing me, how could you despair? That's her whole pitch in her life. She's basically saying, I'm terrible. So God did this for me. God will do the same for you. All you have to do is just keep praying. That's her message. Just keep praying. She's a very relatable saint, in my opinion. A mystic for the conflicted. Because before she starts having all these rapturous, visionary experiences, she's conflicted. Let's get into it. She writes, I began to indulge in distraction after distraction, conceit on top of conceit, vice compounded by vice. The truth was, I was vain and worldly. I liked it when people held me in high esteem. The background here is she became addicted to kind of wasting time with visitors to the monastery. So Carmelite monastery, they're supposed to practice enclosure, meaning they're cloistered. They don't leave the monastery, but they'll have visitors come, maybe drop something off for them. And there's a kind of grill. It looks like an iron gate. And there's a little kind of turntable they would use to deliver goods. But the nuns of the Incarnation, they kind of grew a little lazy, and they kind of opened everything up, and they had a nice little parlor down there, and they'd entertain a lot of guests, perhaps instead of praying. And look what she writes. I knew quite well there is no excuse for giving up prayer. And then she says, this did not stop me, however, from continuing to miss the mark. My life felt very heavy to me because prayer illumined all my faults. That's a great insight, because she was still trying to do 2 hours a day, by the way. Again, it's not, some of it was reading, some of it was imagination, some of it was silent prayer. And she found that the more she prayed, the more she realized how selfish she was. And that can be a hard thing to bear. God was calling me in one ear, she continues, and the world beckoned in the other. All the things of God filled me with joy, but the things of the world held me captive. It seems to me now that I was struggling to reconcile two fundamental opposites, the life of the spirit and the pleasures and distractions of the senses. Now, she's going to put things, if you've read the life, she's going to put things in a very medieval way, kind of a dualistic way, like the world is bad and God is good. Not everything about the world is obviously bad, but she was getting thrown off from her major commitment, prayer. Look what she writes here. I spent almost 20 years on this turbulent sea, falling and rising only to fall again. My life was so far from perfection that I barely took any notice of my minor spiritual mistakes. I was concerned about committing grave errors, but not enough to remove myself from the temptations that might lead to them. When I was trying to be with God, my worldly attachments would agitate me. That is a great experiential description. I imagine many of you are trying to or are already committed to a life of prayer. If you are, I imagine that sentence resonates with you. It does with me. My attachments agitate me when I'm in silent prayer. Even while I was busy consorting with the world, He, God, gave me the courage to keep practicing prayer. Prayer is the means by which we can repair all that is broken. Without prayer, it is almost impossible to make amends. Oh, may the spirit of evil not tempt you, as it has tempted me, to give up prayer out of false humility. Instead, let's believe the words of the one who told us that if we sincerely regret our mistakes and return our full attention to God, He will meet us with the fullness of His friendship and grant us again the blessings He gave us before, maybe even more generously than ever if our repentance warrants it. She also says, if the friendship you desire to have with His Majesty is authentic, I don't think you need to worry about ego. When you notice the first egotistical stirrings, disclose them and you will emerge victorious. Disclose them in prayer. And for her, disclose them in confession. Or you might disclose them to a spiritual advisor. But her point is, become aware of them, keep praying. So 20 years goes by, she's in the convent. This is after she's sick, and she's being tugged in two directions. But there's a definitive point. After 2 occasions of being so powerfully moved, overcome by distress over my sins and deep soul weariness. So this is precipitated by her encounter with a statue of Jesus. She gets overcome by her sins, and she develops this soul weariness. She's weary with having to keep up her attachments. I began to leave my wicked ways behind and to devote myself more constantly to contemplative prayer. I did not give up those harmful old habits completely, but God helped me to gradually turn away from them. So mystics aren't made in a night, folks. It takes time. And it's okay. Terry herself is our authority here. Mystics are people. They are people who make mistakes, who continue to make mistakes. Doesn't seem to bother God. All His Majesty was waiting for was some measure of preparation on my part. Then the spiritual blessings continued to blossom in me, as I will now describe. But it is very unusual for our beloved to grant such grace to someone whose conscience is as impure as mine. So after this point, she has mystical experiences, meaning raptures, visions. She starts to hear voices, and all this could make you conclude, oh, she's a lunatic. But her visions, her spiritual experiences are always verified. They don't just happen and then she wanders off into like fantasy land. She becomes more grounded and real because of that. But then she takes a break in her Vita to describe more deeply what's going on in prayer. So there's this whole section called the 4 waters, where she tries to describe prayer or the deepening of prayer. She uses the image of water to describe what happens to a soul in prayer. She writes, it occurs to me that our garden can be watered in 4 ways. We can pull water up from a well. This is a lot of work. Or we can turn the crank of a water wheel and draw the water through an aqueduct. I've tried this method and I know that it is not as labor intensive and yields more water. Or we can channel the flow of water through irrigation ditches. This results in deeper saturation of the soil and lasts longer, which makes less work for the gardener. Or the water may come directly from an abundant rain. This is when the Lord waters the garden himself without any effort on our part. And this is by far the most effective method of all. It is important to me to apply these 4 ways of watering the garden to the 4 degrees of prayer. So we're going to go through those briefly, but can I stop for a second? Lisa, I don't have a clock on me. Can I have a time check? Would you mind?
It is about 8:08.
8:08. Okay, I think we can keep going. Thank you, Lisa.
Yep.
So here's the first water. I'm not going to read all of this, but I'll try and focus on what is most essential. And you will have these slides, by the way, at the end. Feel free to review them yourself. We might say that beginners in prayer are the ones who draw water from the well. As I have mentioned, this requires a lot of labor. Accustomed to a life of distractions, they exhaust themselves trying to recollect their senses. Beginners need to practice withdrawing their attention from what they see and hear. When I speak of trying to draw water from a well, what I mean, of course, is engaging the intellect in meditation. So these are the first water are people who are just starting to pray, who are maybe using prayers like the Lord's Prayer, or are imagining scenes in the life of Jesus. Terry's born not too long after, I think not too long after Ignatius of Loyola. So the Jesuits are just starting spiritual exercises, their whole use of the imagination in prayer. She has many Jesuits who are her spiritual directors. So at this point, you have to make a lot of effort. And that's her image here of drawing water from a well, pulling up a bucket. But she remains consistent. Those whose souls progress are the ones who set out in the path of contemplative prayer with determination. Because while the beginner may say prayers or imagine a scene, Terry imagines that the first water is also a transition to silent prayer. Kind of like how she first did contemplative prayer, along with imagining a scene in her head of Jesus and with reading a book. Those helped her, and then they helped focus her on the silence. So that's how you can kind of imagine the first water. Determination, though, is key. The theme of her Vita is not just what God has done for me, it is a solid teaching, just keep praying. She says some version of that like 30 times in a chapter, every chapter. Just keep praying, just keep praying. And look a little further down, it is our determination that he desires, meaning God. Determination, in fact, a determined determination is Terry's phrase. But just above that sentence, many people start on the spiritual path but never reach the end. I think this is because they refuse to embrace the cross. Believing they accomplish nothing, they become despondent. They cannot bear it when the intellect ceases to function. They do not realize that when the mind is stilled, the will is growing strong and robust. So what is she talking about there? She's saying that you might start praying with prayers, imagining a scene, engaging the intellect in kind of a studious meditation, thinking about spiritual stuff. But to go into contemplative prayer is hard because, as she says, we're used to kind of a life of distraction. So to go from lots of activity to silence, she says a lot of people don't survive that transition. They think they're not doing anything. They become sad. They can't bear it. But her advice remains. Just keep praying. And have faith. Look, second line from the bottom. We have so little trust in God and so much regard for ourselves that worries like these, meaning whether our prayer is going to profit us, or whether we're doing anything in our prayer. Is it really worth it? These worries so easily throw us off course. And I'd add for us, when you get into silent prayer, all the things that you are generally worried about, they don't like take a rest. that's like prime time for them to attack you and get into your head and really get you agitated. But her point here is just trust in God. We should stay there in God's presence with our minds quiet, our thoughts at rest. So here we're doing the work, okay? We are making the effort. The second and third waters are a little different. Turning the crank of a water wheel, the gardener harnesses the forces of nature to pull the water through the aqueducts and obtains more water with less effort. She no longer has to work constantly, and she can rest a little. This describes the prayer of quiet, a supernatural state of interior recollection. So let's stop there, okay? The second, third, and fourth waters are a deepening of the prayer of quiet. And the prayer of quiet is when one of our faculties goes to sleep, and it's God who puts them to sleep. The faculties of the soul are the memory, the intellect, and the will. Your choosing power, your power of recalling thoughts, feelings, and experiences, and your power to reason. All of that goes to sleep at different levels. So what does she say about the second water? This state is an ingathering of the faculties, allowing the soul to savor the sweetness of prayer more deeply. The other faculties are neither lost nor sleeping, they are suspended. Only the will is actually occupied. The joy is bewildering to the soul. And all the souls need to do during these times of quietude is be still and make no noise. Ignore the intellect. The mind is nothing more than a grind mill at this time. It's a great image. The mind is a grind mill. So what's being pulled on, what God is acting on most in the second water is your will. That's the faculty that's being caught in God's embrace. And I have to say, I've experienced this, and it's weird. It's weird because your mind keeps going. She says the mind is nothing more than a grind mill at this time. Your mind still churns out thoughts, churns out feelings, memories, worries, all the things you want to think about, pleasures, something to excite you. And yet the will, that power that allows us to choose to remain in silence or choose to just get up and say to hell with it. The will is almost captured. And I've been in that state. I'm like, I can't quite get out of this. It's unusual. So I just wanted to share that with you because it happens. It happens, and it happens quickly when you start to practice silent prayer. But it's something supernatural. God is taking over. She does tell us, though, don't force it by trying to violently shut your mind down. Just making your mind a blank, don't do that. It's kind of a gentle resting from actively thinking, even though your thoughts and feelings will still kind of pass through your head. But the third water is a little deeper. The third water that nourishes the garden of the soul, the water that flows through a stream or a spring. In this state of prayer, the faculties are lulled to sleep. They do not entirely cease to function, but they do not understand how they are functioning. So here it might be more like the will and the intellect are caught by God. Because look what she says. The memory and imagination in this state remain free. So in other words, and this has been my experience when I do silent prayer, I tend to imagine, I don't know, winning the lottery. That's one thing that just kind of comes up in my mind a lot. So my imagination will go off to the races. What if I win the Mega Million jackpot? So that's going to happen in the third water, right? Imagination is going to roam free. And imagination can go in a good direction like that. Something that's exciting and pleasing about the lottery. It can go in a bad direction. What's going to happen If this doesn't happen, what's going to happen to my family? What's going to happen to all? So imagination can go in many directions. But the point is, imagination wants you to think, to get involved with what it's imagining. Terry says, pay no attention to it. Pay no attention to it. I love what she writes. Pay no more attention to the memory than you would pay to a crazy person. Just let it go its own way. We must patiently endure it. So these waters are experiences, okay? For the most part, you're going into prayer like Terry, let's say for an hour. She's doing a little picturing of a Jesus scene. She's doing a little reading. She's having more and more time to just be in silence with God. But then occasionally God grabs her will, grabs maybe her will and intellect, and she remains in the silence longer. And then God lets her go. This may be not happening every single time she sits down to pray, but it's happening often. The fourth water is different. The fourth water she calls the prayer of union. In this new state, the ordinary senses are transcended. The soul rejoices without understanding what she's rejoicing in. She recognizes that she is enjoying a good thing, one that encompasses all good things within it. But the goodness defies comprehension. The senses are so occupied with this joy that they are not free to experience anything else, exterior or interior. The faculties are all drawn into union. So whereas earlier was maybe just the intellect and the will, now it's intellect, will, memory, and our senses. In the beginning stages of the spiritual path, the heavenly rain almost always falls after a long period of contemplative prayer. So she's trying to say here, this is an experience where everything gets absorbed in God's silence. But it doesn't happen unless you've spent a lot of time in silent prayer. She writes, then the Lord spoke to me. The soul utterly dissolves, my daughter, so that it can fully unite with me. It is no longer the soul that lives, but I. Since she cannot comprehend what she understands by not understanding. So Terry, one thing you have to know about Terry is that she's not just having these kinds of experiences in prayer. She is also hearing God talk to her literally, hearing physical voices, supernatural voices more, but she's hearing voices. She's having visions of Jesus. She's having raptures where she gets drawn, it feels like she gets drawn out of her body. She's meeting angels. She's having a lot of crazy experiences. So this is kind of par for course. God is talking to her in words she can understand. She writes, all I can say is that the soul sees herself as one with God. There is an abiding sense of certainty that accompanies this encounter. This soul is incapable of doubting the truth of her union with him. So all those other experiences may have been good, but it's this fourth water that really brings union with God. And this comes about through prayer. And even here she says, just keep praying. Keep at it. She also writes this, almost without knowing it, she is doing it. The soul begins to benefit her neighbors. The fragrance of her flowers has grown so sweet that other souls are attracted to her. They recognize her virtue and want to partake in the holy feast. Few souls reach this state without having suffered innumerable misunderstandings, criticisms, and illnesses. But these trials cultivate the soil of the soul. Detachment from self-interest softens the earth, allowing the water to penetrate it so thoroughly that it almost never becomes arid again. So in other words, the more you pray, the more this prayer quiet could happen. There's another way, the way of John of the Cross, where nothing happens. And then you just kind of wake up in this state one day. But Terry's path is you start to psychologically experience some kind of overflow from prayer. And the culmination is this prayer of union. You slip into prayer and then you kind of don't slip out of prayer. God accompanies you wherever you go. And the more you do things, the more you're doing them out of love. You're not necessarily going on a crusade to save the poor, but whatever you seem to do helps your neighbor. Whatever you seem to do, it just kind of spreads the perfume of God's goodness and mercy. Terry's going to need that for the next phase of her life. But I just wanted to read to you before we get into that next phase very briefly. This is her most famous rapture, extraordinary mystical experience, which, by the way, she doesn't recommend that you have, or that she doesn't write you should be having these. She's just saying this did happen. It's captured in this sculpture by Bernini, Theresa of Avila in Ecstasy. So let me read it to you. I invite you to just close your eyes and listen. So she's in prayer, and then she says, I saw close to me toward my left side an angel in bodily form. The angel was not large, but small. He was very beautiful, and his face was so aflame that he seemed to be one of those very sublime angels that appear to be all afire. I saw in his hands a large golden dart, and at the end of the iron tip there appeared to be a little fire. It seemed to me this angel plunged the dart several times into my heart, and that it reached deep within me. When he drew it out, I thought he was carrying off with him the deepest part of me. And he left me all on fire with great love of God. The pain was so great that it made me moan. And the sweetness this greatest pain caused me was so superabundant that there is no desire capable of taking it away. Nor is the soul content with less than God. So I invite you one more time, just take a look at that picture of Theresa of Avila in Ecstasy. You can see that Bernini is trying to capture this sense of superabundant sweetness and yet also pain. But it leaves her all these mystical experiences she has, and she describes many of them in her life. They all leave her in the same way. I want God. That very last line in the bookmark prayer, God alone is enough. So this is our last slide. She ends her life, the book of her life, with addressing the task of founding St. Joseph's. She describes becoming a foundress. One day I was talking with a small group of women about the lack of spiritual depth at the Incarnation. The nuns' monastery was not very spiritual, oddly enough. We expressed our yearning to live and practice prayer like the ancient desert fathers and mothers. If we can't go to the desert, Maria said, why can't we found a little monastery of our own with just a few sisters where we could live an austere life of prayer together? Maria's question echoed my own desires. I began to discuss the idea with Doña Guiomar, the widowed lady I had mentioned, because I knew she shared this vision. She immediately set about trying to secure the funds necessary to establish the new house and provide it with a modest income. Some time passes. One day after communion, His Majesty spoke to me. You must strive with all your might to make this dream of a new monastery come true. I promise it will not fail to thrive, and it will be of great service to me. He told me that we should call it St. Joseph's. St. Joseph will keep watch over one door, he said, and Our Lady at the other. Christ will live among them. This place will be a star that will radiate its light everywhere. After a lot of suffering, criticism, and many blocks to founding of St. Joseph's in Avila, on August 24th, St. Bartholomew's Day, she writes everything was ready. The Blessed Sacrament was in place. The first group of sisters received the habit. Antonia, Maria, Ursula, Maria. Thus, with all due authority and power, this monastery of our most glorious father, Saint Joseph, was founded in 1562. So then the story of the foundations, her other book, that's kind of like a history, then that takes off. But that's where her life ends. God has given her a dream. She is ready to fulfill it. And she's got the energy and the holiness. And that is the key here, the holiness needed to carry out what God wants and to be effective, truly effective in the world. This is our last one, and there are questions. And this summarizes again her life. I repeat, let no one who has cultivated the practice of contemplative prayer grow discouraged and say, if I end up reverting to my old ways, it would be better for me to give up prayer altogether. I believe things will get worse if the person abandons prayer and refuses to quit his bad habits. But if he stays the course, prayer will carry him into the harbor of light. And now I offer you these questions because I believe Lisa is going to send you off into some small groups to talk about them. And I think she'll give them to you again, but feel free to look at them now and talk about them. But let's, look at them, not talk about them yet, but look at them and reflect on them. But now I turn it over to Lisa for that part of our evening.
All right. So maybe, well, I guess we'll leave them there for just a second. So if we need to address any questions before we go into small groups, we can do that. So think if there's anything you need to know before we send you off. The idea is this: we will go off into our breakout rooms. Most of you, having been on Zoom before, will have had that experience of getting Star Trekked away to a little group of a couple of people you can talk with as we consider these questions that LJ has given us. I will keep an eye on all of you, make sure to the best of my ability that things are going well in your rooms. We'll give you 10 to 15 minutes there, and then we'll come back together and we might share things that have happened in those small conversations. And certainly that will be a time to ask any questions that you have of LJ. Welcome back.
Welcome back, everybody.
All right, I'll leave it to you, LJ.
Great, welcome back. So we want to take the last 10 minutes or so to field any questions you may have. So you are free to write them in the chat, or you can just raise your hand, or really just unmute yourself and ask me, because this isn't school. So feel free. If you have a question, you can either, just unmute yourself or just wave your hand and I'll call on you. So any questions? Yeah, George, go ahead.
Hi, LJ. I met you in the summer. I don't know if you remember me. I was at your Meister Eckhart at your church.
Yes, hello, George. Welcome, welcome.
I got my cat here,
Hello.
Jasper.
Hi,
So
Jasper.
I tuned in to the center because I was rereading Tony DeMello, and I was watching the videos that you made for the center here. But having all of these mystics, which ones do you there's so much here. There was so much with Anthony DeMello, Meister Eckhart. What's it like in your mind kind of to have them all, and what do you gravitate towards in practice?
It might just be me, but I think they're all kind of talking about the same thing. And they might have different words, slightly different accents on one practice. And Terry talks about it as prayer. DeMello talks about it as awareness. Eckhart talks about it as detachment. And Terry's friend, John of the Cross, he'll talk about it as contemplation, spiritual poverty. And these terms you'll find kind of down through the ages and in really all the mystics. But they all kind of come together in the practice of prayer. So I tend to think of them, I do like history. They generally have one word that summarizes their practice and their theology. And for Terry, it's prayer. For DeMello, it's clearly awareness, right? And then others have their own word. But it's a kind of very compact word that expresses their practice, but also hints at their own understanding of God. Because you don't have a practice without some understanding of God. And Terry, she has this great faith in God's goodness and in God's mercy. And that, remember that line I wrote to you, that she wrote, that I read to you, prayer heals all that's broken, and God will give us even more than when we, if we return to God, than if we hadn't sinned at all. And that's to me, is a very Jesus thing to say, and that might be another good unifier, George, is they all reflect some aspect of Jesus' teaching, which is detachment, spiritual poverty, prayer. I mean, and prayer that flowers into love of neighbor. But that's generally how I look at these folks. Yeah. Hope that helps. Thanks, George. Great question. Anyone else? Colleen, it looks like you're asking a question. Would you mind? There you go.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay.
This is more a question of, I don't know, geography, if you will, but is her monastery there in Avila still active?
Is it still active? That's a good question. I think it is. It's still there. And so she has 2 monasteries in Avila, which is still very much a real city, and it has its old ancient medieval walls around it. It looks like an old city. But the Incarnation is still there, and that was the really big monastery with up to 200 nuns. And St. Joseph's is also still there. She, and you may I read it fast, so I wouldn't be surprised if we missed it. But part of the idea with founding new Carmels, new convents and monasteries, was to keep them small. So St. Joseph's had 12 nuns, not 200. And we'll get into this next week, but she made sure that the class distinctions that were very much prevalent in the Incarnation did not carry over into St. Joseph's. Everybody was a social equal upon entering the monastery. And that included whether you were pure blood or mixed blood, high class or low class, poor or rich. That all ended as soon as you entered the new, her reform. This becomes her reform movement. And it changes Spain and the world, in interesting ways. But they're still active. Yes, I think they are still active. Both are still active.
Well, the reason I ask is one time we were on a train in Spain, in Avila, and it was pouring rain and we had no hotel, and we somehow stumbled into a monastery, and they were very gracious, and they said, you can stay, but your husband cannot. And so, of course, I wasn't going to stay in out of the rain without him. So we trudged on through it and finally found a pension. But I just wondered, if that perhaps was what she started all those years ago.
It could be. You could have but there are probably several. Well, in Terry's own time, there were a lot of convents. There were a lot of monasteries. That was part of the problem. Because the mayor of Avila, once he heard Terry was founding a new convent, he probably would have said, no, that's
no more.
More money out of my coffers. And you know what? The bishops probably thought the same thing. So, but I don't know if there's as many there now, but there's a chance. Yeah, there's a chance you may have stayed in one of those monasteries.
Well, that will be my story.
That's great. Any other questions or comments you want to make? Stories you want to share?
I have a question, LJ.
Chris?
And I may be jumping the gun to something you will do for us next week or the following week. I'm just wondering, aside from Terry's writings herself, which you mentioned, the 4 of them, are there other sources, other books that you've studied or you would recommend for us if we want to go a little deeper with Theresa?
Sure. So Lisa and I were talking about this while you guys were in your rooms. The best translation of her life and the interior castle that I found is by a woman named Mirabai Starr.
Mhm.
Excellent translations. Everything that I quoted to you in this presentation was from Mirabai Starr's translation of the life. Starr with 2 R's at the end. She's wonderful. She works with Richard Rohr a lot. She's just a wonderful translator. If you want the full collected works of Theresa of Avila for 4 major books, plus a lot, she wrote some poetry. The bookmark prayer is in her poetry. She wrote spiritual testimonies. She wrote a commentary on the Song of Songs. There's a lot of other things in there. And it's in 3 volumes, and it's put out by the Institute for Carmelite Studies, which actually is right here in the area in DC. Translated by Kieran Kavanaugh and Otilio Rodriguez. Kieran was actually, he died just a few years ago. He was also a local here in the DC area. So those are her major works. There's also 2 volumes of her letters. Highly recommend those. That's where you get the real human flavor. In addition to a book we're going to cover next week, The Foundations, you get a lot of humanness to Terry in her letters. And those are in 2 volumes. But if you wanted to study a little bit more, there's a great book by Mark O'Keefe. He's a Benedictine monk. I think he lives out in Minnesota. So it's a current book, but it's a book on Theresa called The Way of Transformation, I believe. I'm actually going to use it next week. The authority, if you wanted to go not just deeper in terms of spirituality, but intellectually on the mystics, the authority in the English-speaking world, his name is Bernard McGinn. Mm-hmm. Bernard McGinn has written the history of Christian mysticism. What is he up to now? I think he just finished, not just finished, this was years ago, but he finished, I think, 8 volumes. And there's a whole volume on the golden age of Spain. And he does a great job addressing Terry on Theresa of Avila. So Bernard McGinn would be great. But the Institute of Carmelite Studies, ICS in short, if you go on their website, you will also find some excellent books on Theresa. But off the top of my head, Bernard, or if you wanted to stay on the more spiritual route, but still very intellectually good, The Way of Transformation by Mark O'Keefe would be pretty good. Although that only covers one of her books really extensively, and that's The Way of Perfection.
LJ, will you spell McGinn for me? I'm trying to throw some of these things into the chat.
Capital M, lowercase c, capital G, I-N-N. Bernard McGinn.
All right. I'm putting as much as I can in the chat for you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's exactly it. Bernard McGinn. Great.
Okay.
He was a professor at the University of Chicago until maybe 10 years ago. I think he retired. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he spoke a few years back at the Shalom Institute, and which is wonderful.
Wow.
Yeah, it was great.
He's great. He's done a lot of great work on Meister Eckhart. He wrote a whole nother book on Meister Eckhart. He's a prolific writer, so it's not like he writes books like in his sleep.
Well, great. Thanks. That will keep us busy for a lifetime or two. So
yeah, exactly.
More than a lifetime.
Final question or thought before we log off from anyone?
I just want to remind everybody that same time, same station next week. We'll have our second session, and I hope that we see everybody there 7:30. And we'll, I know that it will be just as enlightening as this one was.
And if there are no more questions, I'd like to draw your attention to a few upcoming events from the Center of Spiritual Deepening. Next week we'll be on, and Lisa, correct me if I'm wrong, the same link for Zoom, or is it going to be a new link that comes out? Same link. And then on the 30th, we'll do the third session. We're going to try to do a hybrid event. We will be having a festive meal at St. Aidan's at what time again, Lisa? I can't remember.
6:30.
6:30, followed by LJ at 7:30 for the third week on Theresa. Beyond that, pay attention to the website in your email. We'll be doing a Lenten series starting the 20th of February, I believe, for several weeks on poetry. And the theme will be Wendell Berry and Sabbath poetry. So I'm looking forward to that. So again, watch the website and your emails. And then I will note February 24th, we'll be hosting a Lenten retreat with Hilaire Henthorn, who's on the call tonight. So
Brave.
yay, looking forward to Hilaire. So just stay tuned. A lot coming up, and that's just the next couple of months. There's plenty coming up over the spring and summer. So we look forward to seeing you all.
Thank
Hello,
you.
Hilaire. See you there.
Alrighty.
But
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks,
Right.
LJ.
Just keep praying, everybody. Bye-bye.